these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
The world loves great storytellers. The entertainment industry spends billions every year capturing stories onto film, writing them down in books or in songs in front of sold-out arenas. We're enamored by speeches from movies, shows, and moments in history. Political speeches of the past, like JFK's "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech in Houston, Texas, comes to mind. But my guest today is the man who wrote what is perhaps the most famous speech in American foreign policy history. Peter Robinson was a speechwriter in the Reagan administration, serving under Vice President H.W. Bush and then President Reagan himself. He's responsible for President Reagan's address in West Berlin in 1987, where he spoke the famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Years later, Peter Robinson is now at the Hoover Institution as the Murdoch Distinguished Policy Fellow, where he writes about business and politics and edits Hoover's quarterly journal and hosts a show I'm sure many of my listeners know because my listeners are into the wonky stuff, Uncommon Knowledge. Also author of 3 books. So Peter, thanks for being on. Thanks for taking the time.
Are you kidding? My pleasure. Anytime you want to talk, that's fine. But anytime you want me to shine your shoes, I'll do that too, Dan.
I got people for that.
Okay. Well, I owe you.
They're usually me. I like to shine my shoes. But I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to have you. It's an honor. You've got so many amazing stories to tell. And part of this, I do want to focus on just what it's like being a staffer in Washington. Washington still remains sort of a mystery to people. And with my podcast, I take the time to illuminate parts of it, of course, and give people a glimpse in, which I think is important. It tends to be true that the less people know about an institution or a subject, the more they start filling that void with other ideas and narratives. And Washington, that our political narratives are full of that, and the internet has probably made it a little worse. How do you even get into a speech writing job in the White House and just basically out of college, or how did that path go, and how old were you?
I'll tell you, I'll tell you all about it. But what I can't do is tell you how it's done, because you're about to hear, if you hear my story, you're hearing the story of a one-off, a fluke.
That's my story too,
Well, maybe there's something to the point. Is there's just no tried and true path to becoming a speechwriter, any more than there is to becoming a member of Congress. I grew up in upstate New York. I went to college at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and then I went off to Oxford University to study for a couple of years. And then I stayed at Oxford. I rented a 500-year-old cottage, which incidentally had about 500 years of deferred maintenance, to write a novel. And I got into that project, and I produced a novel so bad that even I couldn't stand to read it. And I suddenly realized I'd had a good time at Oxford, but I hadn't qualified myself for the working world in any way at all. I thought, oh my gosh, some of my buddies at Dartmouth they're in banking jobs. They're law school.
What was the novel about?
The novel, Dan, I was trying to write a historical novel. There was I'm trying to remember the dates now, 18th century. This is it just sounds crazy now.
That's really hard to do.
Yeah. It turns out it's very hard to do. I had no idea how difficult it was.
Yeah.
There was a fraud. There was a con man in 18th century London who for a couple of years had invited to all the best parties, the balls and so forth. And he claimed that he was from Formosa, from Taiwan. And he published a book in which he must have been a very intelligent person. He invented a language and invented stories about the customs of Taiwan. And it turned out that in his telling, the people of Taiwan had certain habits, including they ate each other, they engaged in strange sexual practices. All this he was the People magazine of he was he was the internet of his day. And then the whole scheme collapsed. People realized he couldn't possibly have been telling the truth. And in his later years, he became a friend of Dr. Johnson, Boswell's Life of Johnson. Now, why I thought this obscure figure, of course, I liked it because it was colorful, but what was in my head that this obscure figure from the 18th century that nobody had heard of him in any event. It was just as crazy as it could be.
So it never got published?
No, never got published. I never finished it. I sort of came to all of a sudden. I looked at this material I was producing. I came to. All right. So in other words, I was an English major who was just as screwy as any English major could be.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote letters to people I thought might be able to help me find a job back at home. And one of the very few people who responded was William F. Buckley Jr., the great conservative journalist, who had been kind enough to notice some of my work when I was a student journalist at Dartmouth College. Bill suggested that since I liked politics and writing, I should go to Washington. It's now 1981. And see if I could, 1982, actually. This is the winter of 81, 82. And that he suggested I get in touch with his son, Christopher Buckley, who was writing speeches for Vice President George H.W. Bush. So I did. And Christopher said, oh, this is interesting. I presented myself to him at his office in the old executive office building. And Christopher said, well, I'm leaving the job in 2 weeks, and my replacement has just fallen through. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to write speeches for the vice president. By the way, while you're in the building, go downstairs and talk to Tony Dolan, who was then Ronald Reagan's chief speechwriter. While I was talking to Tony, the phone rang. It was the campaign chairman for Lou Lehrman. You won't remember these names, Dan, partly because you're too young and partly because you're a Texan rather than a New Yorker. Lou Lehrman was a businessman running for governor against Mario Cuomo. By the way, he only lost by less than 3 points. It would have changed everything if Lou Lehrman had won, and we'd have been spared 2.5 decades of the Cuomo family. In any event, they were looking for a speechwriter. So Christopher Buckley told the Bush people that he'd found the perfect replacement, me, but they better move fast because Lou Lehrman wanted to hire me. And Tony Dolan told the Lehrman people that he'd found the perfect speechwriter for them, but that they'd better move fast because the Bush people wanted to hire me. And at the end of 2 weeks, I'd been flown to New York 3 times for interviews. I'd been in and out of the White House for interviews. I had offers from both operations, the vice president's office and the Lehrman campaign. And I decided I'd better go with the vice president because there was more job security. Lou Lehrman might lose that fall, as he did, but George Bush would be safe at least until 1984. Nobody asked to see a writing sample, which was a very good thing for me because I had never written a speech before in my life. And when I was the vice president's press secretary, took me across to the West Wing to meet the vice president and said, Mr. Vice President, this is Peter Robinson. I'm recommending him as your new speechwriter. And George Bush sort of looked at me and smiled, and then he looked at my feet, and then his eyes came slowly up to my face, and then he turned to Pete Teeley, his press secretary, and said, well, he looks about the right height. Let's hope it works out.
How old were you?
And I was 25. That, Dan, is how I got hired at the age when you were a Navy SEAL. That's how I got hired as a speechwriter to the vice president.
That's pretty wild. It's hard to replicate that.
It's very hard to replicate that. That's right.
You know, I mean, it's just right place, right time, which is a lot of how history is written, I suppose. It's also it's definitely hard to see how you could replicate it, especially now.
Oh yes.
But how, okay, so
now there would be background checks and security, this and that and the other. And in those days, no, it was just much more relaxed.
Yeah, the 80s were fun.
They were actually. They were.
Okay, so then how do you prepare? I mean, you obviously know how to write, but it is different writing a speech, let alone
that's
a speech
for sure
for someone else, let alone a policy speech. So did you come into this job with a ton of policy experience?
Well, no, zero policy experience. I just
or at least policy education.
Policy education, I suppose, about as much as a 25-year-old could have had. By the way, the only other jobs I'd had, this was the first full-time job I'd held in my life. The only other jobs I'd had were summer jobs. I'd worked at a fast food restaurant flipping hamburgers one summer. I'd worked with a construction firm driving HVAC equipment that would have been fabricated in town. I drove it out to construction sites. That was my work experience. All right. So it was lucky for me in a certain, first of all, a couple things happened. One was that George Bush and I just hit it off.
Mm-hmm.
He was just the loveliest man in the world. And he was a very fatherly figure. He and his youngest son, Marvin, and I became friends. We were the same age. So I was sort of the age of his own boys. And he treated me with a kind of fatherly mercifulness. He sort of cut me slack. The very first speech meeting I went in, nobody took me aside and said, here's how you be a speechwriter.
Mm-hmm.
So I just assumed that it was my job to take notes on what the vice president would want to say, and then I'd go write it up in some flowery language.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you my first speech meeting with him, I went in and it was just the two of us, which was good. I learned later that he was sort of a man's man, meaning he was at his most relaxed when it was just a couple guys in the room. So it was him and me, and he leaned back and put his hands behind his head and put his feet up on the desk and said, "What do you got?" And I said, "Well, next week you've got the National Association of Manufacturers, and the week after that you're talking to these two groups. But again, the first one is National Association of Manufacturers next week. What would you like to say?" Said I, sitting across from him, yellow legal pad, my pen poised to take notes. And he looked at me and said, "I don't know. What do you think?"
Figure it out. Yeah, that's why you're here.
But it hadn't. Oh my goodness, I had no idea what he should say. And so I engaged in emergency thinking, and I just talked about tax cuts and staying with the president's program. This is the summer. By the time I started in the summer of '82. The economy was going into a recession because the president's, they'd enacted the tax cuts, but they weren't going to take effect until later. And Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, was crunching down on the dollar. So we were in a steep recession. And so my recollection is that I came up with some sort of stay the course, stick with the president. This is going to work over the longer term. But the point was that in saying to me, "I don't know what I should say. What have you got?" George Bush was saying, "Look, I'm busy.
Yeah.
In case you hadn't noticed, I'm the vice president of the United States. I've got phone calls to make and meetings to attend and places to fly on Air Force Two.
If I knew exactly what I wanted to say, I wouldn't need you.
I
now,
wouldn't
would I?
need you. You're the 25-year-old kid. You figure it out." And that was that. I got it. I understood that was my job. So from then on, there would be several different pieces in writing a speech. One was to learn everything I could about the audience. Who were they? What were they going to want to hear? I'd call people who were organizers and talk things through on the phone. What do you want to hear from the vice president? And then I said a moment ago, it was lucky for me that I started for the vice president. And that's true because George Bush wanted to make sure there was no distance between him and Ronald Reagan ever. Now, George Bush privately sometimes wondered whether the tax cuts were too much, too fast. He had some doubts, but publicly he was going to support Ronald Reagan without question every single time, which meant that if I read the president's speeches, I knew where George H.W. Bush wanted to stand as well. So I was able to crib my basic policy positions from the president's output, from Ronald Reagan's speeches.
And it's an interesting thing people don't quite understand because, I mean, your common citizen might say, well, I mean, you're one of our elected leaders. You should know what you want to say in any given speech. And the truth is there's a bit of a balance because you are being kind of like herded from event to event. And look, you do mostly know what you want to say. Sure. And if you don't, you're right. You shouldn't be in politics. Now, there are a lot of people who really don't know what they should say. And so what do they sound like? They sound like robots spewing out your latest talking points and kind of sound bites.
Well, so let me ask you, how do you do it? They say, "Congressman, 5 o'clock tonight, you've got a full day of meetings. You've got a committee meeting. 5 o'clock tonight, you're speaking to such and such a group. Have you got a kid on your staff who will pull together notes for you? Or do you extemporize every single time? I bet you at least want information on the group you're speaking to, right?"
Of course. So yeah, especially with these like specific groups. So, you said National Manufacturers Association. So you got to have some facts in there. But I also try to avoid like just telling them stuff about their industry,
Right.
because that's usually what your common staffer will do. And so you have to like wake them up out of that. You'd be like, look, I don't want to go there and just tell them stuff about themselves that they already know. Like that sounds really boring if you're in their seat. They want to hear something different associated with what they do, and so that's a bit more of a challenge. And I think we've got a decent process for it. I wouldn't say I have a speechwriter. Most congressmen don't have a quote unquote speechwriter, but I suppose their press person, their comms person, is in charge of writing speeches. But it's nothing like in the White House, of course, where you probably have multitude of speechwriters for different kinds of events too, because even one speechwriter couldn't do all of the comments for every single event, and then that the executive or the congressman, the president, the vice president has to then trust too that if I don't go over this speech, can I at least will it be readable when I read it?
Right.
That's a whole other question, and probably takes a great degree more of trust. And so I'm not really giving you a great answer on many speeches, especially I write them myself. If it's an important speech, I'm writing it myself. I
hope the people of the Texas 2nd Congressional District know how lucky they are. A congressman who can write.
Yeah.
There are not that many. I mean, and I sound facetious. I don't really mean to sound as facetious as I do. Writing is hard, and I've become convinced over a long lifetime of it now that writing is not only is it hard, but it's still essential. It is the way we figure out what we really think, which is one reason I always felt that Ronald Reagan could prove so compelling, because all his life he read widely and wrote constantly. George Bush was a good writer. It was clear we were there to save them time, not because they couldn't do the job themselves. So that's don't you find though that if your staff clears some time for you and you actually do the writing, it's hard to describe, but you feel as though you're coming to positions in a more solid way than you could, right? Than you could by any other means.
Yeah. It's like the Jordan Peterson line. You can't distinguish writing from thinking. It's that's
exactly it.
It's probably the clearest form of thinking.
Yes, exactly.
Is to write it down. I certainly don't think I write enough, but I try to get back into op-eds. I used to write op-eds constantly. But yeah, I mean, you should write your own speeches because it's noticeable when staff writes it. Like there is no like staff writing class, but it sure seems to me like there is, because everybody seems to have sort of the same ways of saying things, and so it's obvious when somebody else is writing it.
That brings us to Ronald Reagan. I was on the vice president's staff for a little under a year and a half, and loved it, and I loved him. I really did love him. That's important to note. There's a club for former speechwriters.
Well, it means you care, right? It means you actually care about how this is going to go off.
Right. Anyway, and then there was an opening on the president's staff. He had a staff of 6 writers at any given time, and 2 left after the 82 midterms. And it took them a while to figure out what to do, but they hired me to replace them. Okay. So here's why Ronald Reagan was just different from all the other people for whom you might have written. By the time he became president in 1980, he'd been speaking in public. Now, he was a movie actor beginning in the 30s, but he spoke regularly at least as early as 1948, when he headed an organization called Hollywood for Truman. In those days, he was a Democrat. He started giving speeches when he was still a young man, and by the time he became president, he'd been at it for more than 3 decades.
He had a radio show too, right?
He had a radio show. He had a 5-minute radio show on Saturdays that got carried across the country. As far as I can tell, we researched this. Now, he was an unusual speaker in a couple of ways. One was that he tended to, when he was before he was elected governor, he would make index cards of quotations and interesting thoughts, and that was his kind of rolling speech. He'd shuffle the index cards around or add a couple of new index cards. So we don't have records of very many of his speeches, but we know he spoke constantly. We know that he was always adding to and adjusting to this file of thoughts, so to speak. But we don't have any of those. We have very few of those index cards anymore. When he became governor, he was notorious for this, that he'd finish a speech, he'd come back to the office, and he'd take the speech and rip it in two and drop it in a wastebasket. It was a way of kind of clearing his mind and moving on to the next thing. And it wasn't until several years after he'd been governor that he got a secretary, Elaine Crisp, who got a secretary who thought, wait a minute, he's the governor of California and he might someday become president. And she started fishing things out of the garbage. So we begin to get a record. But when he was governor, he wrote about half of his speeches himself. The staff, I went back and talked to people, a lot of these people are dead now, but he had a staff, but he wrote about half of his speeches himself. The point I'm trying to make is that for us speechwriters, when it came to Ronald Reagan, you knew where he stood on the issues, and you also knew what he sounded like.
Yeah, he had a very distinctive voice.
Exactly. It wasn't our job.
And you talk about in your book how that was different from working for Vice President Bush.
Yes. Vice President Bush, God bless, he was a wonderful man in all kinds of ways. But speech writing was just not his greatest strength. And he didn't take it all that seriously. I can remember, oh my gosh, Dan, these are painful memories. Handing him, there was one speech where he wanted changes, not because he'd read it. We were on Air Force Two. We were flying someplace. I can't remember. I think it was Texas, actually. And he called me forward. The plane begins to descend. That's when giving the speech is the next thing on his agenda, he finally looked at it. And he'd flipped through it. He hadn't really read it very carefully. And he called me forward and he held the cards. We printed these things onto cards. He held the cards in his hand and said, "It's a little heavy. You better cut it in half." All right. So I start dictating a new speech in the motorcade to the event. They have a staff room set up. I finish it. The secretary types it as fast as possible. And then the Secret Service takes me down one hallway after another. I think it was a high school. And the door opens and the vice president is behind the curtains. And I can hear the announcer on the other side of the curtain say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States of America, George." And I handed him the speech just as the curtains started to open, and I had to kind of run back to stay behind the curtain. The point is that the first time he'd seen that speech was when he delivered it to the audience.
That's a little scary.
Reagan was never that way. Reagan, so for George Bush, you'll understand this because you've been at this a while now yourself. For George Bush, giving speeches was a distasteful duty. It was the price you had to pay for the real work of politics, which is attending meetings and making phone calls to members of Congress and lobbying people for this or that position.
Yeah, he was a policy guy. I mean, it's important to note that working for this guy, he was before he was VP, he was a congressman, U.S. ambassador to the UN, U.S. ambassador to China, director of the CIA,
and his view,
World War II vet.
Right. That Hamilton. The Hamilton musical, the song "In the Room Where It Happened," George H.W. Bush was the kind of politician who believed that things happened in a room. You got powerful people together and figured things out. Reagan put it the other way around. Giving speeches was to him the central act of governance. It was the most important thing he did. If he persuaded the American people, then Washington would fall into line sooner or later.
Right.
So Reagan, so he was much more disciplined. Always, he would review a speech before giving it. He would mark these speeches up in great detail, often in great detail. Sometimes he'd only change a word or two, but he was always reading the work. Our work was due to him 48 hours before he would deliver a speech, and he would take speeches upstairs to the residence and review them in the evening, and we'd get the speeches back the next day with his markups.
I wonder if it's still how that's done. It does seem to me that there's just so many events on a daily basis. Maybe I actually don't know what it was like back then, but it's like one thing after the other in this day and age. And so you have a choice. You can either just riff like the President Trump style. And then oftentimes he would just read something. If he guys doesn't care that much, he would just read it. Biden, they probably have him doing less than your normal president. And if they don't, then they definitely should be doing it a lot less. But it's very difficult to get into this point where you could like read a speech. It's hard for me to read a speech 48 hours in advance, and I'm no president.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that, of course, as this principle sets the priorities, and he wanted the stuff. The other thing is, say with Donald Trump is a good example. When Trump delivered, I think half a dozen speeches that I would consider really impressive pieces of work. Mm-hmm. He spoke in Vietnam, his speech in Saudi Arabia. I thought the best speech he delivered. He gave a couple of State of the Union addresses that were really, as speeches, pretty magnificent, beautifully constructed. Mm-hmm. The speech he delivered in Warsaw, where he said the central, I can't quote it exactly, but the central question of our time, right? Yeah. The central question of our time is whether we have the will to defend our civilization. Yeah. You can organize an entire administration around that one question, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. But when he gave a full dress speech like that, nobody bought it because everybody understood it wasn't him. Mm-hmm. The distance between the text and the speaker was too great.
Yeah.
But with Reagan, he'd been working with texts for decades. This is what it meant to come up as through the ranks as an actor and as a radio performer. The writer's bungalow is over there on the movie set. The actors are shooting over here. The script arrives in bits and pieces. And Reagan, partly because he was so technically adept, and partly because we writers knew where he stood and could hear him in our minds as we wrote for him, there was no distance with Reagan between the text and the man. That text was his. He always made sure that it was his before he delivered it.
And it sounds like him. I mean, he does have a style that you know, and you talk about this, how you can just hear him saying it. And that was more difficult to do with Vice President Bush. One question I really want to ask you before it leaves my mind, because I didn't have this one written down, was, you know, in my readings of Reagan, especially his speeches and his radio addresses, especially, he always had a way of, and this is really important, he had a way of expressing facts, statistics, oftentimes in a compelling way, to make his argument. He was very good at this.
Right.
And a couple of things come to mind. One, it takes a certain kind of judgment to be able to discern which facts are important for the argument. And, you know, this is a back and forth I always have with my staff. I'm like, why does this particular fact matter? Like, and how do we distill that into a fact that matters for the argument? And so, you know, we've become quite good at that as a team. But then somebody's also got to research those facts, and it's a hell of a lot easier to research statistics and facts these days than back then. Like, was he just an avid researcher of I wish I could have an example. I don't on me, but he was always saying things like, you know, never before here's time for choosing speech. Like, never before in history has a nation survived when the top third, or whatever, a third of, you know, or over a third of your income goes to the U.S. government, or whatever it was. It was like pithy little things like that just made sense even to a layman who didn't quite understand economics. And I guess my question is, was he doing all that research? He must have been, especially when he was doing his radio addresses. He had this large staff of researchers, like even I do, where I can be like, look, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. I can tell them this is the kind of statistic I'm looking for. I know it exists. Fine, just give me the numbers, just fill in the blanks. And I'll actually write speeches that way, where I was like, blank, blank, blank. You just got to fill this in because this is exactly how I want to say it. I think I take a lot of that from Reagan. And then how did you guys adapt to that when you became his speechwriter?
Dan Crenshaw, you are one perceptive listener to Ronald Reagan. Almost nobody. People respond these days to the emotion he could elicit. Very few people. Well, you're a professional yourself, I suppose. He cared a lot about constructing arguments. He wanted factual, fact-based arguments. And I heard I don't know. If I heard him say this once, I heard him say it 3, 4, half a dozen times. He would say to the speechwriters, well, specificity is the soul of persuasion. So,
but the right amount.
The right amount. Before he became president, he was the researcher himself. He read constantly. Now, I once asked Bill Buckley what he and Ronald Reagan talked about when they were alone together, because of course they were friends. And Bill was the founder and editor of National Review magazine, a conservative magazine. And Bill said, well, we really don't talk about policy because every time I see him, he's read the most recent issue of National Review from cover to cover. Well, that tells you something. He's reading and making notes and saving interesting facts for his card file, as I say. By the time it came to the White House, as I say, he had 6 writers and there were 6 researchers. And in those days, cast your mind back, listeners, young listeners especially, there was no such thing as Google. You want to a few facts on economic growth in Germany, say, and upstairs the researcher goes to the library, not huge, but a big library in the old executive office building, comes back with a stack of books. Imagine that. We actually had to leaf through books. So now the question you raise about what's the right amount, how exactly do you deploy facts without becoming fact heavy, without becoming boring? And there, all I can tell you is that Reagan always had. Now, maybe he learned it as an actor, maybe he learned it in radio, and maybe somehow or other he just had it. He just had an ear for it. But he always understood pacing. And there would be, I can remember a number of speeches where they'd come back and he would cut a paragraph because it was too much to ask of the audience. It was going to, he could sense from a text where he was going to start to lose the audience, where they start to get bored. Or he would, I remember one speech when I first joined his staff, between 2 paragraphs, he put a caret with the words "insert farmer joke." So I had to go.
He just had a sense for it, about how that flow should happen.
Exactly. He knew where the audience was going to start to get a little bored, where he was going to have to relieve them by giving them a laugh. He had a sense for pacing. And again, I can't say exactly how or when he developed it. By the time we got there, he had it, so that we only had to match, in a certain sense, the work he himself had done before becoming president. But very, very important point about Ronald Reagan. He always worked in popular media. So he graduates from college and he talks his way, in the middle of the Depression, when a quarter of the American workforce is unemployed, he talks his way into a job as a radio announcer. And he announces sports in the Midwest. That was a big job in those days. Radio was a very important medium in the 30s. And so he's always talking to, he grows up in the Midwest. He grows up in small towns in the Midwest. He attends Eureka College, which is a small college. He's a radio announcer. He's always talking to ordinary people. He never engages in any he never sounds like a professor. He goes to Hollywood. I used to remember these numbers. I think in the first 3 years, he appeared in something like 17 different movies. He used to say they didn't want them good. They wanted them Thursday, meaning they were just turning out product. And so what does this, he doesn't care. He learns very quickly that you really don't care what the critics write. What you care about is box office. Are you registering with ordinary Americans? He starts getting fan mail. And he answers a lot of his fan mail himself. And what he can't answer himself, his mother answers, writing for Ronald Reagan. So he's all his life, or we now know, if you look at the some 8,000 letters that he wrote as president, very few of them are to famous or powerful or important people. At the end of each week, Ann Higgins, who ran the correspondence unit, would give him half a dozen or a dozen letters from ordinary Americans that were representative of the kinds of letters the White House had been receiving that week. He would take these to Camp David and he would answer several of them in his own handwriting. So the dentist in Moline pops off about the Reagan economic program, and a week later in his mailbox, he has a handwritten defense of the Reagan economic program by Ronald Reagan. So he's always in.
When's the last time that happened?
Yeah, exactly. He's always in touch, almost in communion with ordinary Americans all his life. he understands that as his audience. He's talking to his kind of people, ordinary American voters.
Did he
And
do
that's
anything
very
for
important.
fun? I mean, what kind of, do you get to have any hobbies when you're president?
Well, he and Mrs. Reagan loved to watch movies.
Yeah.
And of course, what he loved was his two hobbies, I think, this would be fair. First of all, he was reading all the time. He liked novels. He liked history. His hobbies were watching movies with Mrs. Reagan. And of course, they couldn't watch a movie where they didn't know the actor or the writer or the producer. For them, it was a kind of way of reliving their earlier phase of their careers.
Sure.
And then he loved to go to the ranch, work outdoors, cutting brush, and above all else, he loved riding. He just loved horses.
He has a crazy collection of belt buckles you can see at the Reagan Library.
Right. Belt buckles. And then if you go up to the bar, I haven't been there in a few years, but if you go up to the steel shed that he used as a barn, there's a big collection of tackle and saddles. I mean, he was a serious rider.
Yeah.
Serious rider. He used to say there's nothing as good for the inside of a man as the outside of a horse.
I don't know if that would play so like kind of totally unrelated to speechwriting policy question. You talked earlier about how the initial term of the first Reagan administration was coming out of massive inflation. It was like 12 or 14%, and it gotten down
double digits. That's right.
And that wildly under control. They passed the tax cuts. What, in 1982? What else happened? I mean, it's an important policy question for what we're facing today. We're not facing inflation that is that bad, but what are some of the policy measures that took place at that time?
Sure. Well,
I know I put you on the spot on that
one. No.
I'm
I'm just thinking to myself, how do I summarize this? Because I was about to say for younger listeners, but then I look at you and I say, Dan, this is important for you too. You don't remember this. You're too young.
I wasn't even born.
1979, we'd been through, the Arabs had embargoed. We'd been through an Arab oil embargo. Gas lining up at gas stations, alternate days. You could only fill up your tank on alternate days. If your license plate ended in an even number, you got certain days of the week, and an odd number, you got other days of the week. The Soviets in December of 1979 invaded Afghanistan, the biggest land operation since the end of the Second World War. Tanks rolled into Afghanistan. And of course, a couple of months before that, 50-some American diplomats were taken hostage in Iran. It was bad. And inflation, as you mentioned, is in double digits. We've been through the disaster of a defeat in Vietnam and the national humiliation of Watergate. And the last president to serve 2 terms was Dwight David Eisenhower. Kennedy gets killed. Johnson gets tossed out of office. He didn't get tossed out of office. He was humiliated by his own party when Gene McCarthy ran against him in New Hampshire, and LBJ realizes he can't win re-election. It's just the presidency doesn't seem to work. The economy is bad. Unemployment is high. Inflation is soaring. The Soviets are on the march, and the Arabs feel free to humiliate us. That's the background against which he takes office.
There's a lot of similarities, isn't there? We just had Saudi Arabia refused to increase production, just had the Russians again.
There are.
Massive land invasion.
That's exactly correct. That's exactly right. So, Chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, Milton Friedman told me that no other president would have permitted the Fed chairman to do what Ronald Reagan permitted Paul Volcker to do, which is to squeeze down the money supply. The economy does go into a bad recession. Unemployment jumps up, but it gets inflation under control. Reagan cuts taxes, reducing the highest rate when we took office. I can't remember, to 70-some percent. And he reduces it down to 3 brackets, just 3 tax brackets, in which the highest rate was, I believe, 33%.
Mm-hmm.
He begins rebuilding the military right away. And in 1983, if I'm recalling this correctly, was it 80? I think it was 83. We put Pershing missiles. We began to deploy Pershing missiles, intermediate range nuclear force missiles, in Europe. Now, this requires a step back. You know all of this history. We had long-range missiles that could hit the Soviets. The Soviets had long-range missiles that could hit us. But during the 70s, the Soviets put hundreds, I think it topped out at about 600, short-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe, targeting Western Europe. And their idea was to subject the people of Western Europe to a kind of psychological terror and separate the United States from Western Europe. And the NATO requested the United States to deploy short-range nuclear weapons in Western Europe that would offset the hundreds of missiles the Soviets had already deployed, but it was very, very tough. The nuclear freeze movement in the Reagan first term, Bruce Springsteen sang at a nuclear freeze concert in Central Park, which for years, and maybe still, I don't know, but for years it held the record as the largest outdoor gathering in American history, a protest against Ronald Reagan. Mrs. Thatcher, there are massive protests in Britain. I flew with Vice President Bush to Germany, and he was giving speeches in support of our deployment. And the motorcade in which we were riding was stoned. People threw bricks and stones and hissed at the President of the United States. So Reagan loses in 1982. Republicans lose 26 or 27 seats in the House.
Wow. Unemployment
goes up. It's the most serious recession since the Great Depression. Our allies are shaken by these massive protests. And Ronald Reagan has to sit there and persuade the American people to stick it out. And he did.
I mean, that's quite a persuasive ability. I mean, and they turned it around. And is there a matter of luck involved here to turn it around? And by the time election season comes in 84, because he won overwhelmingly in the 84 election.
What happened was that inflation went down to single digits by re-election time. And then when the tax cut finally took full effect, all my economist friends say that the one mistake about the tax cut was that it should have taken effect. The legislation should have been written to take effect immediately.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. The tax cut finally begins to take effect in the summer of 83. And in August of 1983, the Dow Jones starts to recover. And we get an economic expansion that begins within a couple of months and continues really until the financial crisis of 2008, 25 years of economic expansion with a couple of brief recessions. So by the time Ronald Reagan runs for re-election, well, of course, to begin with, you could tell the day he's inaugurated, the Iranians back down and release our diplomats. So it feels as though something new is happening right from the first day of the Reagan administration. But by the time he runs for re-election, employment is beginning to pick up. The economy starts creating over 100,000 jobs a month. The country was smaller then. 100,000 jobs a month was a big number in those days. The markets start to soar, so people's retirement accounts begin to fatten up. Inflation is down from double digits down to low single digits. As I recall, it was 4% or a little below 4% when he runs again in 1984. And sorry, go ahead.
These tax cuts in 1982, I mean, it's not like we had a Republican-held Congress, right?
Oh, that's right. Well, so another thing, jeepers creepers, I feel like grandpa here talking to, you're a very important figure, and here I am filling you in on stuff that happened before you were around, Dan. There were 30 to 40 conservative Southerners who were Democrats, but there were 30 to 40 Democrats in the House who voted with Ronald Reagan, the so-called boll weevils. That has changed. The parties have now realigned themselves on ideological lines. So the South is now held by Republicans. In those days, it was still held by old-fashioned Democrats who were John Cornelius Stennis was the longtime senator from Mississippi. I remember this because when I was still working for Vice President Bush, he called me in. We were doing an event in Mississippi on behalf of Haley Barbour, who was then running for governor of Mississippi. And the vice president called me into his room before the event, and he said, listen, on Air Force Two just now, I just got a call from John Stennis. And then George Bush went into a Southern accent to imitate John Stennis. And Senator Stennis said, George, I'm hurt that you would enter my state and campaign against me. Haley Barbour was running for the Senate against Stennis. And Stennis said, George, I knew your daddy when he was in the Senate, and I've been voting for you and President Reagan right along. And it just hurts me that you go into my state and campaign against me. So George Bush rewrote this. Well, he dropped any praise of Haley Barbour from the speech and just gave a brief speech in praise of Ronald Reagan. Anyhow, that was the way the Democratic Party was.
It's totally
in
different.
Those days in the South. Oh, those figures are gone now. They're all gone.
I mean, what do you make it just as a general conversation of the political divisions between now and then? How is it the same and how is it different? Because on the one hand, I do think it's important for people when they think everything's worse than it's ever been, right? That's a common feeling. But it's a little more complex than that. It's not quite worse than it's ever been, but in some ways it does feel like it is worse than it's ever been. But you've been watching politics since the early 80s. What do you think?
I'll tell you one thing to which you'll respond, because this affects your job and the way you lead your life. Today, the political climate is such that it's almost impossible for a member of Congress to have his family with him in Washington. Mm-hmm. He has to be able to say, my children are going to school back home.
Right.
Because otherwise voters, it turns out that's an issue. In the 1980s, it wasn't that way. My wife, now wife, grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. Ordinary middle-class neighborhood in Bethesda. Around the corner lived John Rhodes of Arizona, who was the House Minority Leader. 2 doors up lived Mel Laird, who had come to Washington as a member of Congress from Wisconsin and gone on to become Secretary of Defense. I happened to be at her house a couple days before Christmas. The doorbell rang and it was Mel Laird, former Secretary of Defense. Mm-hmm. And for 30 years, every Christmas time, he'd gone through the neighborhood and given everybody a cheese ball, Wisconsin cheese ball. 1 block over lived Ed Muskie, and Ed Muskie of Maine, Thomas Eagleton of Missouri. My wife's brother dated Christy Eagleton. They knew each other. The Shrivers, my sister-in-law, dated one of the Bobby Shriver. And Tip O'Neill, we went to Mass at Church of the Little Flower in Bethesda, Maryland, and whenever the Speaker of the House was in town, he was at Mass. He didn't stick around to talk to people, but Tip O'Neill showed up for church on Sundays. And you know what? There's a limit to what you'll say about a man when your kids are on Little League together. Mm-hmm. You know? So in those days, it was a smaller town, and people understood and knew each other as human beings, as parents, as people of the middle class. By the standards of many Americans, the income of a member of Congress is pretty impressive, but it's a middle class income. So that is different. People knew each other they knew each other. Democrats and Republicans would turn up at church together, or their kids would be in school together. They knew each other as neighbors, members of a certain kind of community. I don't know what that world is gone. I don't know how to bring that back.
I don't either. I don't think you can. And I'm not sure when it changed. It's certainly been that way forever.
What's your working week? Do you have to fly home to Texas every Thursday? How do you do it?
There's no routine at all.
Really?
It is just,
really?
Yeah. I mean, it's, you're definitely, we don't feel like we're at home a lot because it's not just flying to DC and back. It's doing events, maybe all over the country. Maybe you got to fundraise it as much as you can. So that takes you just on different trips, all over the place. God forbid, every once in a while you might take a personal trip, and so then you wake up one day and you're like, God, I haven't been home in a few weeks or a month, and it does make it tough because if you want to have a decent working environment in Washington, D.C., it's nice to have a place to stay.
Yes.
And so you have a number of options. You can live in your office where there's no shower. Number of members do that. Maybe their wife never comes or their husband never comes with them. Their family is just never coming with them. So that's how they choose to do it. Or you can get a hotel. And that's a problem because now you got to pack literally every single time you go. And so most of us have either rent or, I've got a really big 485 square foot apartment that we have. because my wife comes up a
on
lot
Capitol
with me.
Hill.
Yeah. And so, you have to have
But she travels with you
often. Yeah.
Okay, good.
And so you have to have 2 mortgages or 2 rents. And, it is what it is. Now, DC never feels like home to me. So I kind of like the culture of this being my home in Texas. It's also a super easy flight from Houston to DC, but you got a lot of members that that's just their first stop, and then it's another flight, maybe an hour or 2 drive. And I think that the reason this happened this way, because look, I mean, in theory, everybody should just move to DC, right? Your entire job is to be a representative in federal government for your constituency, and so we elect you and then we send you there. That's the whole point. That American culture has changed quite a bit, where as soon as the kind of the populist tagline of like, those bums just go to DC and forget about us, like,
right,
it just becomes what people say and think,
right.
and they're not really thinking through what that means or whether it's true or not. But it certainly is a great soundbite for your opponent,
right?
And whenever that started happening is when this trends changed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is what it is. One thing I want to, before, I don't know, we kind of run out of time. That hour went by really fast, but I never got to ask you about the tear down this wall speech. I guess what's interesting about that speech, I think, for the audience, is that it almost didn't happen in the way that it did. So it's such an iconic line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But it wasn't an iconic line at the time. Is something I didn't know. It became an iconic line later when the wall actually fell. So what was the drama associated with putting this sort of bold language in there about the wall, about the divisions between East and West? Explain how you were thinking through that. That this is one of the speeches you wrote in its entirety, right? And
correct,
and was edited very little.
Well, yes. It went through. Okay, I'll just tell you the story. The important point of the story, I'll tell you the conclusion. I'll start with where it ends. Well, it starts and ends in the same place, and that is with Ronald Reagan. So I was a 29-year-old speechwriter. Word came down that the president was going to be speaking in West Berlin, and I went with the pre-advance party to West Berlin to get material. You know what a pre-advance party is, but for the listeners, they're press people who are going to be looking at camera angles, security people who are going to liaise with the West German police to make sure the president's trip is secure at each moment, so forth. And then I went along and I went to the place where the president would speak, right in front of the Berlin Wall, and I climbed an observation deck and looked over into East Berlin. This is just impossible to convey to people who didn't see it for themselves. But there you were in West Berlin, light, color, prosperity, lots of Mercedes-Benzes, sense of action, activity, modern city. And you look over the wall and all the color disappears. Gray, very few automobiles. The biggest part of the people you can see is soldiers, ordinary pedestrians walking slowly as if they had no place particularly to go, because I suppose they didn't. And you could just feel the weight of oppression, of communism. It was real. You could feel it. And then I went to have a meeting with the ranking American diplomat in Berlin, who said, listen, don't make him sound like a commie basher, and don't make a big deal out of the wall. They've all gotten used to it by now. And at the end of the day, I went to a dinner that was put on for me by some West Germans, Berliners. I'd never met any of them, but we had friends in common in Washington. And I told them that the American diplomat had said they'd all gotten used to the wall by now. Was that true? And the hostess at that event said, they went around, different people talked about the wall. They were, one man raised his arm and he pointed and he said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about that wall? So it became clear they'd stopped talking about it, but they hadn't gotten used to it. They still hated it every day. And our hostess said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk of glasnost and perestroika, he can come here and prove it by getting rid of the wall. So I put that in my notebook. Why? Because I knew Ronald Reagan. I knew that Ronald Reagan would have responded to that remark, that the simplicity, the authenticity, the truthfulness of what she said. Okay. There's a much longer story here, but in brief, I constructed the speech around the call to tear down the wall. I had a lot of help in working things through, deciding that we could pull it off, from my boss, Tony Dolan, the chief speechwriter, and from a guy called Tommy Griscom, who was director of communications. And we sent it into the president. We pulled a little bit of a fast one on the staffs to get it to him before it went out to staffing. That wasn't the way things were supposed to work in the Reagan White House, but we were young and we pulled a fast one. We got it to him. And then there was a meeting in the Oval Office, and we discussed a number of speeches, and then we got to my speech. And I explained to the president that I'd learned in Berlin that people would be able to hear the speech on the other side of the wall, the communist side of the wall. So is there anything in particular you want to say to them? And the president thought for a moment, and he said, well, there's that line about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to go. That wall has to come down. And then the speech went out to staffing. And I think it was 3 weeks between that day and the day the president delivered the speech. And the State Department and the National Security Council fought the speech for all 3 weeks. They submitted one draft after another, every one of which omitted the call to tear down the wall. And finally, in Europe, Ronald Reagan decided he was just going to deliver the speech as written and include that line. Ken Duberstein, who was with him in the limousine on the way to the Berlin Wall, and who just died 6 months ago or so, said that by the way, that very morning, the State Department submitted another alternative draft. They were trying to talk him into it. And he told Ken Duberstein in the limousine on the way to deliver the speech that he was going to stick with the first draft. And then he leaned over and slapped Duberstein on the knee and said, the boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do. So it was Reagan. I wouldn't have written that for anybody else. George Bush, God bless him. I loved George Bush. But whenever I gave him a foreign policy speech, the first question he would ask was, have you cleared this with State? And Ronald Reagan didn't mind overruling State if he thought they needed to be overruled.
They work for him.
They worked for him, correct.
It's so iconic now. What? I know you probably have to go soon. So just cut me off.
I mean, how many times do I get to talk to a hero and a member of Congress and a guy who's interested in the same pieces of history that I'm interested in?
Well, appreciate it. One of the questions I have for you is what would Reagan think of the current Republican Party? Some of the factions that we sort of, in my opinion, manufactured within the conservative movement. How have things changed since Reagan's time in terms of tone and policy? We're starting to get,
I thought for about 10 years after he left the White House, for about 10 years, I could say to myself, what would Ronald Reagan make of this or of that? And I could come up with a pretty rigorous, crisp answer. Now we're in a world so different from his that it becomes much harder, I think. What can I say? I believe he would have found Donald Trump very hard to take because to Ronald Reagan, the ideal of the gentleman informed every moment of his life. And we're dealing with a different set of beliefs about how you carry on in public with Donald Trump. It is often said that Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty for people who were in the country illegally, and that he was very warm toward and felt very comfortable toward Hispanic culture. So maybe he would support open borders. I don't believe that for one moment. It is true that he was very open to Hispanic culture. And when he ran for president in 1980, he called for Puerto Rican statehood. But he would surely have objected to the total breakdown of law at the borders. The 1983 amnesty he signed was a piece of legislation that included two pieces. One was an amnesty for people who were in the country, but the other piece was a whole set of measures to make sure that illegal immigration stopped.
Mm-hmm.
He left office and the government never enforced that second piece of it. So yes, he was open to he certainly loved the country as a country of immigrants, but he would have been appalled by the total breakdown of law at the border.
It's one of the nice things about conservatism is it can't change all that much.
That's exactly right.
That's sort of the whole point.
The government's too big. It spends too much. That's what Ronald Reagan said throughout the 80s, and it's true again today. That we know. He would have taken one look at this and said details are different between us and the Soviet Union, but here's what worked then: peace through strength.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need. That's the fundamental principle today again.
It's like you talked about the massive protests against Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. We're talking about these intermediate nuclear capabilities.
Right.
Also, when he showed up in Berlin to make that speech in '87, I read there was 50,000 protesters there. What were they protesting exactly at that time? Was it the same thing? Was it the same thing we see now, where, and this drives me crazy about the Ukraine and Russia issue, where they're the ones who started a war, right? They committed an aggression, we respond to it, and then our own team accuses ourselves of being a warmonger. And it seems very similar to the sort of mentality and the frame of mind that was happening back then, where they just sweep aside the fact that this is a response, this is not an initiation. And yet it's hard for me to understand that.
I agree with all of that. That part of it, this is something I didn't appreciate at the time. The extent to which people just get scared.
Yeah. It's basic fear response.
It's just basic fear. If you lived in Germany, still today, but certainly during the 1980s, Moscow has weapons that Germany doesn't have, and the United States has weapons that Germany doesn't have. And basic decisions about the freedom and viability of Germany get made where? In Moscow and Washington, and not in those days in Bonn. Many decisions got made in Bonn, but this feeling of helplessness, and we saw it again during COVID. I was shocked that so many people went along so readily with masking and locking down the whole country long after there was any medical evidence that it was doing a darned bit of good. But you know what? People were scared. And that, I think more and more, that one aspect of Reagan that was more important than I understood at the time, his cheerfulness, his self-confident demeanor. There was some basic way in which he was communicating all the time, this is going to be all right. This is going to work out. He was reassuring people. And that I now think is, that was a more important element of his personality than I understood at the time.
Do speeches, you think, have more or less impact than they did back then? In the 80s, not as many TV channels.
Right.
If the president was giving an address, it was like there's probably more viewership over it than there would be now. What's your general comparison?
I don't recall any circumstance in which the Reagan White House, the White House in which I served, requested airtime from the networks when they said no.
Yeah.
The president wanted to go on the air at 9:00 tonight. Boom. CBS, NBC, ABC, they all clear their schedules, and they're all going to use that feed from the Oval Office at 9:00 at night. A president of the United States in those days could command the attention of the nation. That is a lot harder for anybody, including a president, to do now. So, or I was talking to my buddy, like, this sounds pretentious, but he is a buddy. We've been friends for a long, long time. Rob Portman, outgoing Ohio Senator Rob Portman, that when Rob Portman first came to the Senate, or first came to Congress 30 years ago, you could count on reporters to cover important pieces of legislation. You can't count on them to do that anymore. The press has changed. So members of Congress, members of the Senate have to run their own press operations in a certain sense. They have to take to social media to tell their own stories, something we're especially good at. So
well, I tell people all the time, you know why we raise so much money is because you're not going to our website. You're not, I have to put information in front of you repeatedly.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So that has changed. I don't know. I still believe that if you had a president whom people fundamentally trusted, not that they agreed with him, but that they trusted to believe that he believed what he was saying, that people would, you couldn't command the attention of the entire nation at 9 o'clock from the Oval Office the way Reagan could in those days. But something about this whole question of authenticity, people will still respond when they think somebody is telling the truth as best he can. I think that's my theory about what cuts through. What cuts through these days is the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we'd like to think so. Maybe that makes us idealists, but I do think
if we're wrong about that, then democracy ain't going to work. So
no, that's true. But I still believe it. Right. And as you do, I just think it's harder than before. I do think social media has wildly changed things. It's also changed incentives, and it's made that, the old saying, squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's become way, way, way more true. And politicians are sort of bullied into responding only to that, or they're bullied by their opponents who will only respond to that and get elected. It's a scary thing when that happens.
So here's what I want to come back to you about a year from now and ask this question. So you've been elected twice. You're still in your second term. That's not that long in the House of Representatives. And here's what you discovered very early in your first term. You were good copy. The press loved you. The military background, the way you look so striking on camera, you speak well, you could be on Fox News 3 times a week. Your party is about to win a majority. And I want to know how your life changes. Do you say, I think a little less public outreach here and a little more actually getting legislation through Congress? This old distinction between the workhorse and the show horse. When your party isn't in power, there's really nothing much you can do. There's no good you can do except to make your argument and try to persuade people. But things are about to change in your life, Congressman. And I want to know about a year from now, what effect that has on you. I want to know how you choose to deploy your time.
Oh, so yeah.
I have dibs on you now, right? I get to come back and talk to you after you've been in the majority for a while.
Well, the plan would certainly be, I mean, geez, just out of a simple sense of exhaustion, we've already started to maneuver toward that different path. Because that's the whole point. And one of the things I'm concerned about is, look, I do a lot of the shocking entertainment stuff and social media and put a lot of effort, like personal effort, into creating sort of a process in social media that was compelling and it would grow the platforms. But you can't do that forever. And the entire point of it was always to be a tool. It was always a tool to gain influence, to get good policy done. I worry that I think the landscape has changed quite drastically since 2018, since I ran.
Really?
Wherein there's plenty of people running in primaries these days, and over the course of this year, many of which didn't win, some of which did, whose only real goal is actually to become a social media influencer. Right? They've never cared about policy. They've never read many books on the subject, if any books. They don't know who William F. Buckley is. They don't read any of that stuff. That is not their goal. And I expose this to Americans as much as I can, because you got to be able to, because most people, it's weird. They like move between two worlds of like hyper trust of a politician if they sort of say the right sound bites, and then hyper overall distrust. It's the old, like, well, I want to kick all the bums out. What about your congressman? You seem to like him and vote for him. No, I like that guy. And so there's always this dichotomy in the American voter's mind, I think. And it leads like politicians to gain traction in a way they otherwise would not have in the past, and become these sort of opportunistic grifters. Like, wait a second, I just got to save this red meat or this blue
Right.
meat,
Right.
and boom, you like me. This is the easiest thing I've ever heard of. I don't even have to know anything about policy.
Yeah.
And so I urge people to, don't be easy to lie to. You discern when somebody's BSing you, because it happens a lot. And know that some of your most profound and exalted fighters, quote unquote, are not fighting for you at all. They're just fighting for your attention. And there's a difference.
Yes,
and
is.
and winning in politics anyway means, first, the persuasion part. So communication is extremely important to that. This is why Reagan prioritized it. But then also knowing the policy that you actually want to implement, and eventually implementing that. And so it's a mix of Bush and Reagan, right? Because to really do that nitty gritty work, you do have to be in a room together. It is what happens in that room. But what are the factors outside of that room that make people agree or disagree on whatever outcome happens in that room? That's the outside communication factor. So maybe they were a good team. As a result, maybe that's what makes that entire administration such a success. Well, Peter, that was a fantastic conversation. I know I got to let you go. I know I kept you at least 20 minutes longer than I promised. And I just really appreciate it.
I wasn't squirming to get away. This is fun. And
Yeah.
now I have dibs. It's on the record. Listeners know that you have promised to let me interview you.
Oh, I'd love to be on Uncommon Knowledge. That's one of my favorite shows, and highly recommend it.
Hey, listen, I have one last favor to ask. Keep an eye out for about 1/4 of an acre, because for us Californians, Texas is plan B.
Yeah.
And I think what I would like is 1/4 of an acre and a double wide someplace in your district.
Hey, that's easy. I'm sure you'd
that's
be
my new plan.
Shocked by the prices here. What you can buy.
Happily shocked, right?
Yeah. It's not so bad. It's not so bad. There's plenty of space. It is Texas after all.
It is Texas after all. I love that. Okay. Thank you, man.
Hey, thanks, Peter. This is great. I really appreciate it.